The simple act of turning on a light switch or faucet and having instant access to power and water belies the complex systems that make these fundamental resources of our lives possible. Electricity is generated by various processes, and the paths water takes to our faucets is often much longer and more complicated than we realize as their consumers. As producers, decisions the Navajo Nation has made regarding their involvement in resource extraction and energy production, both of which intersect questions of water, is even more complex. Participation is an act of sovereignty, and while promising benefits, it has come with costs and entanglements. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brennan Rensing. This month we speak with geographer Andrew Curley about his new book, Carbon Sovereignty, Coal, Development, and Energy Transition in the Navajo Nation. In this book, he guides us through some complicated history and points us to productive ways of strategizing on these issues in our complicated present. Thanks for listening.
For new listeners, allow me to take a moment to explain a bit about Writing Westward and myself. Each episode features a conversation with people writing about the North American West: historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. By showcasing their work, I hope to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who call it home. If a writer or topic intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing role of host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all tasks for which I have no training. But I am passionate about the North American West, so this difficult work is well worth the excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people. At the end of each episode, I'll include a little bit more information about me and my scholarship and about the Redd Center, our public programming and projects and funding opportunities that you could apply for. With that, let me introduce a little bit more about today's guest and why we're talking to them.
Andrew Curley is a member of the Navajo Nation and an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. His book, Carbon Sovereignty, Coal, Development, and Energy Transition in the Navajo Nation, was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2023. This work explores the history of coal and its dominating presence in the last half-century of Navajo economies and everyday life. Used to fuel energy production, which is in turn used to provide Colorado River water to distant metropolitan centers like Phoenix and Tucson, coal and the Navajo Nation's decision to engage in its extraction and lease lands for the related Navajo generating station are much messier stories than you might imagine. The exercising of tribal sovereignty to participate in these kinds of industrial developments brought benefits to many, but also entrapped entire communities in economic relationships that bore extremely unbalanced power differentials. After decades of many Navajos centering their lives around these economies, the decisions to renew leases and agreements in the 2010s were understandably fraught, and they also complicate movements for energy transitions away from coal. The pressing nature of this is all the more intense when the Navajo Nation did renew the Navajo Generating Station lease in 2013 with the Salt River Project utility. But then SRP soon decided to close the plant regardless. Curley's guiding us through these macro-level decision-making processes, along with his ethnographic work with individuals involved and impacted, can be incredibly useful for many around the West, whose communities, even if not indigenous, are likely grappling with their economic entanglements with different industries. In short, his work should push people to search broadly for solutions and to accept that there are no simple ones. The path forward will take work, and that work requires historical context, creative thinking, and open vistas without unnecessary blinders. Professor Andrew Curley, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your book. So let's just dive right in. I want to start by kind of asking you to give us a sense of your personal history with the American West and your connection with the region.
Yeah, interesting. I never thought about this actually as a question, but yeah, I was born in Gallup, New Mexico, and lived most of my life in the Mountain West, or the western part of this continent, mainly in the Southwest, New Mexico and Arizona, and so this is pretty much the region I know best. So this is kind of the center of my worldview, whereas, in the way that we define the geography, it's seen as the West, but to me, it's more the center. So, so that's basically it. I mean, it's just where my family lives, where, the people I know live.
But you did all your schooling back east.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Did that change your perspective on the region?
Good point. And I did spend some time in the Midwest when I was a kid. So yeah, it actually did. It did influence how I thought about things, in that I prefer to live out here. That's an immediate thing I think about. I mean, I wanted to see what that part of the country was like. So that's why I did my schooling out there. I never, before I went to Boston, I never been to Boston. So, so to me, it was just an intriguing place to explore and visit. But in the end, that's not a place where I wanted to live. And so ended up coming back out here. But yeah, no, getting back to the question, it did help me to think about what's different about this place, how is it? And there's noticeable things, just the style of life is different. As many of the people here know, we have to drive a lot more. For many years when I was living there, I didn't have to drive. I walked or biked most of the time. And then when I moved back to Arizona, it was a thing I noticed immediately, is the amount of driving I have to do to get between places. Now it's opposite. Now when I go back east to visit, I immediately look for a car, or in this case, get in a taxi or Uber to go to where I need to go, because I assume everything's by vehicle. And in fact, there's a lot of useful light rail or subways connected to airports. And so, those are just small things, unimportant really to probably the stake of things I will be talking about. But yeah, that's what I noticed when I'm back between the two places.
Do you think about Navajo land, Navajo country differently than you do the West more broadly as a region?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Wests are, this is going to sound cheesy too, I think the Wests are many Wests. Yeah, from the Eastern standpoint, the West is this one big monolith. But as you know, the plains are different from the Pacific Northwest. Very different kinds of ecologies, histories, peoples that live in those areas. And so I think there are many Wests that we inhabit. And so for me, it's even more specific. Yeah. So the Colorado Plateau, where the Navajo Nation is located, it is a particular kind of region that I'm familiar with. And so I think about it differently than I think about where I live in Arizona currently, which isn't considered Southern Arizona. And this is a whole new experience for me too. This is my first time living in this part of the state, even though it's within the same political boundary. They're very different regions. And so, so yeah, I think that the Navajo Nation and landscape around the Navajo Nation is distinct from other parts of the broader West. And the Navajo Nation and that landscape, I would include much of northern New Mexico and even into southern Colorado. So it's beyond the reservation boundaries into a particular look and feel of the place.
Yeah, I always, when I teach about the West, I have this series of maps where I ask my students to vote where the West, begins. And I have these different areas shaded in. And each map gets progressively more and more subdivided into, Pacific Northwest, Northern Plains, Southern Plains, or Texas, everything else isn't Texas, and we all have a good laugh about it. But it is silly to say the West is X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
It is many Wests. It's a really well, tell us about how you came to this topic of coal and power, electricity, infrastructure, industrial development in Navajo country?
Yeah, I came to the topic by looking at it as a development question. So many of the other people I worked with were concerned about it as an environmental question. And when I was back east, I was working on fair trade work and working with organizations thinking about international development. And so I was thinking about places that were producing primary commodities like tropical fruits that eventually become consumed in the global north or in the so-called developed countries, and how that shapes the regions that are producing those things, shapes of politics, the economics of, and the social relations between people. And so I took those questions and I brought it back to the reservation after thinking about it in an international context, and I was thinking, what is the commodity that we're producing? What is the thing that we're selling that's structuring our relationship with the outside world? And at that time, this was in 2007. I had returned and was working at Dene College in the center of the reservation, and there was a proposed power plant to be built on the eastern end of the reservation. It never was built, but there was a lot of advocacy for it from developers, large energy companies, officials in the tribal government, and then there was a lot of opposition from environmental groups. And then it was, slap me in the face, basically say, this is our development question. Coal, it's something that has long structured our relationship with outside entities, in this case, energy companies, utilities, even state governments. And it has made certain kinds of economic opportunities as well as path dependencies possible within the reservation. So yeah, that was what brought me interested, or made me interested. Sorry, brought me to the topic and made me interested in coal. And then as I was further thinking through this question about how does coal structure our relationship with the outside world, I saw that there was a deficit in attention in the existing scholarship and publications, meaning like popular publications, not just scholarship, things that are newspapers or standalone popular books, maybe things that are more polemical or has some sort of political angle to it. The thing that was missing was the perspective and experience of Dene coal workers. So I felt like that was something that needed to be focused on. It was hard to explain, the impact of coal without thinking about the workers. But we were talking about it. We were talking around them often, and so that's why I organized my research to try to focus specifically on the perspective of some of the workers. And again, what I find is that there's not a unified perspective, that there's a diversity even among the workers on how they thought about the industry and who was a worker and how they even define themselves. And so it became complicated quickly, but, what I really wanted to do was look at the laboring force that was part of this industry for decades.
Well, it comes through really clearly, like you're very clear and intentional, and in very implicit ways as well, constantly reaffirming this idea that this is not a monolithic experience. There's no singular Navajo, point of view, which is important. And that's something that, the broader field of Indigenous studies is always kind of hammering at, because the rest of the nation, just thinks in such simplified terms. I also think it's powerful. Yeah, there's like development history, and you say other people have come at this with environmental questions, but really, like, you can't even really grapple with the environmental questions if you're not grappling with these development. Like, it's all so intertwined.
Yeah, exactly.
So you are bringing a lot of kind of some questions and ideas and things that are missing, I think, from a lot of things. I'm also fascinated with commodity histories as a entry point, right?
Yeah.
There's books on like cod or salt, and as like an entry point to explore really broad things. But it's not just coal. I mean, water is a commodity of sorts. Well, especially in Arizona, and electricity. There's multiple commodities in a way that are being exported out of, Navajo lands through all these processes.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that commodities allow us to start entering into a conversation about production and about how people's work. Commodities are often tied to work, and so how people's work is structured around a certain thing, a certain item, their labor involved in, and often these are seen as resources or natural resources, and they structure our relationship with the land and the environment. It's interesting. I wish we had this conversation earlier, because in earlier this week, I was trying to talk to my students about commodity chain analysis, which I found very useful when looking at coffee, and where like values added along the commodity chain, and then how that exemplifies the relationship between importers and exporters, or producing countries and consuming countries, and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that is also visible in the production in the making of commodities coming out of reservations. And so it's an interesting way to think about familiar problems and questions. So if we think about coal as not just an existential environmental question, but like, oh, it's a commodity that's produced. What do we find through that analytical entry point? And that's where we find, the consumers of this, the utilities and their constituents, ratepayers or corporate commission, state corporate commission, all of those entities and people structure and limit what is possible, even in terms of energy production for tribes. So it's a unidirectional relationship. It goes in one direction, and then we have to respond whether we agree to that or not. But there's not that we don't have options outside of what utilities are willing to offer in terms of energy production. So then looking at coal as a base substance that produces the commodity, which is energy, that's the thing that's eventually consumed. People aren't buying coal raw, they're buying it after it's converted to energy. Then you see the people who have control over that conversion process, the utilities, who are managing and owning the power plants. They're the ones that are structuring what is possible in the production of that commodity. So yeah, it is an interesting way to think about some of these problems.
And I think in the West, especially in the rural West, where there are lots of communities that, not that it's like a single economy, but there's a lot of places where the entire community revolves around, a mine or logging or, extractive industries or other things. And because of their rural or remote nature, there's not other options. And so that power differential becomes even more pronounced. And the impacts of the decisions that are going to be made, it's not just that a few people will lose their job. It might be almost everyone in town. And then all the service industries that, serve, the community and whatnot. So
yeah, it can be devastating to places when they lose the one thing that, is employing a lot of people. And that it's useful to outside entities.
So I'm curious though about if you had any trepidation approaching this. I mean, so this is like really messy. I mean, you're right about how this brought a generation of development, livelihoods for people, economic security, also brought some real environmental issues and problems. So I'm curious, and you started doing this project in the middle of a very fraught kind of political moment that we'll get to. Were you concerned about the possibility of your work being more disruptive than constructive?
Yeah, it's hard to know how it's going to be interpreted. I'm trying to think back when I was, it was always a pressing concern. And I think more, not so much in this book, but like when I was writing about what I perceived as a failed energy projects, proposed alternative energy projects that environmental groups should put forward. So to me, that's where I had this quandary of like, is this helpful or is this harmful? this kind of research where I was pointing out what I thought were flaws in their proposal and how and why that, and arguing why I thought the flaws were there. In other words, like I thought that their approach to development in the reservation was one that was based out of outside models of entrepreneurship and bringing these small scale energy projects onto reservations. And it was not attentive enough to the way that tribal governments have been structured over a 70-year period of time, and how tribal governments have a decision-making apparatus that's responsive to large-scale projects, things that are involving hundreds of acres or involving a lot of capital up front from outside entities that the tribe itself doesn't front. And so governments are set up that way and also are experienced that way. So a lot of the officials working in the Navajo Nation, cut their teeth on coal contracts, and then they're looking at alternative energy projects, and it looks completely different. And so they don't know how to respond, or they're thinking about wind and solar and coal terms, and then that creates an impasse in some ways. And so I was saying, it's really the political institutions that are making it harder for this approach to alternative energy projects to develop. And I think, in being critical, it can be hurtful, to say the least, to the people who were put a lot of effort and personal, their personal, they put themselves in effort and money into the advocating for those projects, and taking a step back from my perspective and being critical of it can be seen as hurtful to those people. So that's why I was a little bit worried about how I was characterizing that work. And I don't know if I did the best job, but I was just trying to be as honest as I could.
But you don't want to be perceived as like a troublemaker, who's...
Yeah, I don't want to be...
becomes a persona non grata,
or just, a naysayer or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is maybe my natural personality, so so that can be a problem.
Well, what's unique in kind of the broader historiography of, mining, resource extraction, energy production? What do we need to understand that's unique about the indigenous kind of tribal layer to your story that is, maybe not present in others? Or is there what other work, or how are other scholars engaging with, tribal nations in energy production or resource extraction? Is there a lot of this work being done, and how does yours fit into that?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of work being done, and a couple books that I rely on are Andrew Needham's Power Lines and Dana Powell's Landscapes of Power, and I think I have Dana's book right here somewhere. But what is it that I'm doing? Well, I think what I try to emphasize here, other than the unique way that sovereignty exists, is expressed through energy and extraction projects. I'm adding to the chapter in Needham's book where he's like talking about Navajo nationalism, and I'm defining it, I think, more specifically to say it's an aspiration towards sovereignty defined through energy and extraction in a particular way. And then on top of that, the other thing I'm trying to highlight, which is building off of people who work in settler colonial studies, is the colonial nature of contemporary reservation governance. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between people who work on tribal governance, even economic development, people who are saying what we need to do is focus on institutions and capacity building and nation building. And then people in different fields, subfields, saying all of this is explained through settler colonialism. And, I think there's a lot that's useful in both of those approaches. So I'm trying to find a way to get those things to connect. And I think what I try to do is say settler colonialism as a theoretical framework can be applied to bluntly, and and often is like, I think, conflating historical experiences with the way contemporary colonialism manifests. So, I know that's not going to be satisfactory to people who really are pushing settler colonial theory, but that's how I see it. And then on the other end, I'm saying, our thinking about nation building has to be aware of the colonial context. And sometimes we naturalize the legal political framework into a euphemism called federal Indian law, which is just a series of decisions over a 150-year period, which is further limiting what indigenous nations can do and giving absolute power, almost dictatorial power, to the United States in Congress. And they use this term plenary power. So this is a colonial relationship in any way you define colonialism, right? It's one where the land is held in trust, so-called, by the federal government on behalf of tribes who are seen as too stupid to manage their own affairs, right? That is a presumption that informs this trust status going back to the 1830s. And really it's convenient because it allows the United States to retain control over those lands, which is in effect colonialism. And so calling that out as colonialism, I think, is important because there's only so much work you can do internally with institutions if you can't do other things that other nations are able to do in the larger nation state system. So one hypothetical I always offer is, okay, if the Navajo Nation wanted to enter into bilateral treaty agreement with Mexico and have its own agreement with Mexico or with China or with Cuba, the United States would prohibit that. Any other nation is allowed to make those decisions on its own. So if the Navajo Nation or any other indigenous nation is not allowed to do that, how do we characterize that? That's a form of colonial control. And I think that is something that we need to continue to highlight when we're talking about nation building, sovereignty, and institutions within Indian country, while at the same time not allowing that to be just the only explanation for what's going on. I mean, I think that there's a lot of difference between how utilities approach tribes and how I'm trying to think of how utilities approach tribes today and how settlers dispossessed land maybe 120 years ago, or how the pressures from livestock grazers around the reservation existed. I know that's not going to be something everyone supports. My interpretation is not going to be, unanimously taken up, but that's how I'm seeing it based on, my observations with these lease contracts. And it's not to say that they're any nicer. It's just to say that they're harder to identify. They can be more, they can be hidden. And so sometimes we don't really see the colonial vice grip in operation. That's what I'm more worried about. It's not to say, things are better now. It's just to say that it's subtler and it's something that we need to be more attentive to. These lease contracts are just new forms of colonial control that put us into reproduce existing colonial relations for another few decades, or for another, or for forever. In the case of water rights, we're relinquishing outside claims, or in a broader sense, we're relinquishing alternative ways of thinking about water when we agree to water settlements, because we're conforming to the logic of a water regime that is defined through the Colorado Compact, the Boulder Canyon Act, all of these subsequent acts that are based on the Colorado Compact and the division of the waters to the Colorado Basin states. And, I think that's a fundamental transformation of how we think about water and how we use water. And so we're doing that, but we don't really know we're doing that when we sign these leases or we sign these settlements. So those are the things that I'm trying to highlight in the text, both the sovereignty aspect, how sovereignty is uniquely defined through energy extraction, and then also the ways that colonialism is reproducing itself in ways different from land dispossession or other kinds of colonialisms that we're more familiar with, that we can identify happening in the 19th century.
I find these kinds of approaches really satisfying, though. Like any books I read that seem to simplify things down to, like, grand unifying theories, or, partition history or experiences into like really discrete stages, right? No, that colonial stage is now over, and now it's this. I don't find that satisfying, because it's always more complicated. And so a lot of your work is saying that actually there's forms of colonialism still going on. And I find that very compelling, or I'm at least less initially suspicious, because you're not trying to say like, hey, here's all the super simple answers. You're saying kind of the opposite, right? And I mean, this really comes out, say, like in this decision-making process. Maybe we should get to the actual content of the book. I don't know.
I think somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, we're some of the theory, but let's like talk about some of the stories. So, like,
okay,
you talk about like the Navajo Nation in a way is exercising sovereignty and agency, and its decisions to engage with extractive industries or sign these leases on power plants and so forth. You write, and I'm going to quote. I always apologize when I quote people to themselves. It's the worst, right. But I'm going to do it. You write, it can be a way out of colonization, which on its face we think good, right? But it's you write, and a greater entrapment into capitalist processes and limitations. So, this exercising of sovereignty has, at least in this way, comes with costs, or with there's hooks on it, right? So how does governments and utilities, how did they first approach the Navajo Nation about like a coal-fired electric plant, the Navajo generating station? How did that come to be? And then maybe we can then work our way up to the debates over its renewal.
Yeah, the origin story. I mean, this was for me, the most interesting part of the research was getting into the archives and uncovering. It's not an unknown story, but for me, I learned about it in a different way by looking at the actual memos and papers in people's archives here at the U of A or at ASU, and thinking about how this thing came into existence on the reservation. So sorry, that was all very vague, but let me get more specific. So, as I was going through this lease renewal process and thinking about what was going on the reservation in 2013 while I was doing my field research, I was trying to think about how we got into this in the first place. When did the power plant originate, and where did it in the Kayenta mine and all that? And, what I found is something that's known. People who at SRP even told me this, that the power plant was built in order to provide power for the Central Arizona project. But to me, this, exposed an interesting dynamic that I hadn't anticipated before going into the field, which was energy was serving water. And some of the narratives before that, especially when we're looking at the site of extraction, like where Black Mesa Mine was or Kayenta Mine, a lot of the critiques was its use of water, especially the coal slurry that existed in the previous mine. Using aquifer water to move coal towards energy. And so it's like seen as a profit. Peabody's making money off of water that's being destroyed from aquifer, which is all true. But then, the larger picture is that power plant that I was looking at, the Navajo generating station, was built not for Peabody, but for Salt River Project, for the state of Arizona, and to move water from the Colorado River into Phoenix and Tucson. And that was a larger politics at work in the 1960s when the tribe eventually agreed to a lease with the utilities, in this case, the Salt River Project. And
This is in 69, right?
this was in 1969. Yeah. And so that lease, leading up to it was really interesting. There was earlier in the decade, in 62, I think it was, the tribe had agreed to wait, let me pause. That thing where we do that pausing. I want to say this. I have a new way of describing this. So I say a lot of times we think about the origin of our water economy, of our coal economy as, going back to the establishment of the tribal government. Some people are going to say it's 1923. And I'm saying it's 1963 with the, is that the year? I don't even know the year that I'm saying the origin. with the decision with Arizona v. California on over the waters of the Colorado River. So in this case, the special master agreed with much of Arizona's claims about how much water it could divert and how much and where it has priority rights. And the Supreme Court affirmed this, and I think it was the year 1963. And that gives Arizona the momentum to build, or to try to get the Central Arizona Project built. What becomes the Central Arizona Project didn't have that name at the time, but this canal system to just divert water from the Colorado River into Phoenix. This was a long-standing project by Arizona state planners. And so that is the origin of this energy question and problem that eventually manifests into the Navajo Generating Station in Kayenta Mine. And so for me, it's that decision that has more bearing than the stuff that was going on in the 20s with oil on the other side of the reservation. And so what then happens is the tribe supports the Department of Interior and the Department of Interior, State of Arizona's efforts to try to build two dams along the Colorado River, the Bridge Canyon Dam and the Marble Canyon Dam. So we have a couple of resolutions that the council passed that say, we would like this because it'll bring benefit to us and also the state. This was written by somebody. I don't think it was the council delegates who were writing these. We had an attorney, non-Navajo guy, Norman Little, who was very much, influencing the dialogue and debate around these energy questions.
What were the benefits that they were then listing and saying, here's why we should do this?
That people could work there, and that even that some energy would come from it to the tribe. I believe that's what it said in the resolution. You have all this justifying language up front, preamble, and it just vague benefits, right? Nothing very specific like what we eventually get in the coal mine. And so then, a few years later, the Navajo Nation rescinds those leases in 1966. Norman Little says, no, what you want to do is you want to pursue coal. And there's this whole effort to get the Navajo Nation to open up its coal economy. And the reason for that is because the environmental groups who were like the Sierra Club was opposed to the building of those dams near the Grand Canyon, the flood, and they, some of them were already regretful of not more strongly opposing Glen Canyon Dam and the making of that. The Glen Canyon Dam and the Lake Powell and in the back, and the filling up of really nice canyons in that area. And so, they were already saying we should have not allowed that to happen. We should oppose it even stronger than we did. We can't let two new hydroelectric dams occur in the same region. So for them, they said coal is a better alternative. Secretary of Interior Utah said that. State of Arizona was fine with it. So they said, we need this. We need a power source for our proposed water diversion. It was going to be a hydroelectric dam. A lot of environmental groups are opposed to it. We know Navajo have coal. They need jobs and development. It's going to be beneficial for them. It's going to be beneficial for the state of Arizona. It's going to be beneficial for Upper Basin users because we will put 34,000 acre feet into a lease agreement with with the Navajo Nation so that at least that much amount of water is set aside so that Arizona and California and Nevada don't overdraw and threaten upper basin water diversions. So everybody's happy. It's win-win-win for state.
It's never win-win-win though, is it?
Exactly. And then the environmental groups are happy. That was the other group I forgot to consider. And so that is the origin of that project. And what I always think is interesting is that, people didn't anticipate this long-term socio-cultural identification with coal that eventually develops. And then they didn't really appreciate the degree to which we'd become dependent on those revenues and how we wouldn't develop other industries. It wouldn't be a catalyst for other things. It would just be the thing that we use as a form of jobs and revenues. And
that's the kind of the entrapment that you
it is
you write about.
Entrapment, and then the
and maybe entanglement.
Entanglement is good because that built off of Jean Dennison's work, and that's the concept that she's been defining. So but then you can get more of the metrics and definition of what an entanglement means, a colonial entanglement. And that's the work I cite when I'm thinking through this.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that people weren't considering was greenhouse gases and climate change. So, the environmental groups were like working in this, I don't want to say it was preservation movement. It wasn't preservation at the time, but a conservation logic that was about environmental aesthetics more than ecology.
Yeah.
And even more than, larger questions of climate change. People weren't really thinking about that at that time, even though, there was measurements of carbon in the atmosphere, and they just didn't appreciate the phenomenon enough in 1969. So then we get to 2013, all of that has changed. People are aware of climate change and greenhouse gases. People are aware of dependency, but at the same time, you have this whole workforce that had been working at that mine, in some cases for 40 years, whose livelihoods and jobs were at risk. That is something that wasn't predicted or appreciated at the time of the signing of the lease in 1969.
So from 69, we fast forward, the lease is going to expire in 2019, and the Navajo Nation decides in 2013 to start, well, maybe we'll renew this lease early. And,
Yeah.
And so how are those debates? I mean, you've already kind of hinted at this because the situation is so different. How do the debates unfold differently in, what is that, 45 years later than in 2013, right as you are stepping into this world to try to write a dissertation? What was different about the debate about lease renewal than the original lease debate?
Well, we had 40 years of experience with coal, and one thing is, originally the rate for the coal extraction was really low at the mine site. So even though we're talking about a lease for the power plant, our experience has been negotiating better terms at the mining part of the coal energy complex. And so, after these initial leases were signed, the land lease in 69 and leasing for the mines in the 70s, the mines opened up in the early 70s. And currently, while the power plant is being constructed, then, I'm forgetting the rate, but it was like cents to the ton of coal, 16 cents. It was a federal land rate at the time. So this goes back to, I'm blanking on the act that everybody wants to repeal at this point.
The general mining allotment?
Act, exactly.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, from the 1880s. And it goes back to setting a really low federal rate for mining on federal lands, basically. And because tribal lands are technically federal lands, that was the rate they went with in the early 70s for mining. And then we were like, hey, we're being exploited. We should be able to get a better deal out of this. And this was coming off of energy crisis that happened in the mid 70s.
Oh, OPEC and yeah.
And OPEC really inspired tribal leaders at that time to think about how they can organize themselves into a block, into a decision-making group that can better come to better terms with consuming societies. So they were thinking about it in the way I was thinking about it, like, but 30 years ahead of time. And they were like, hey, these people are consuming the energy we produce, just like the oil-producing countries. We can organize better to negotiate better terms rather than being exploited as much as we have been. So they create the Council of Energy Rich Tribes, right, CERT. And Peter McDonald, our chairman, was one of the people initiating this whole thing. And this is, the person who's identified by Needham and others as like, working in this nationhood or nationalism language. And then at the same time, we have a lot of activism, not just American Indian movement, but a lot of activism in Indian country. And they orient around the idea of sovereignty and self-determination. In 1975, we have Indian Self-Determination in Educational Assistance Act, which puts more decision-making power into tribes. So then they can start to run their own affairs, things that are guaranteed by treaty, mainly things like hospitals and police force, basic services the tribe can run. They can take over those operations through that act. So we start to assert more control. And another thing that's important to think about is that the Indian Mineral Leasing Act in 1938 that was passed to say this is how leasing will happen in Indian country. That act requires the tribe and the leasee or the leaser to negotiate their agreements every 10 years. So by the mid-'80s, we are renegotiating the leases that were signed in the 70s to say, hey, we don't want to do that cents a ton. We want to have more income coming from, coal revenues. We want to maybe even get a percentage of what's sold. So that was Peter McDonald and then Peterson Zaw, and those people were putting together a stronger claim for revenues captured by coal.
So by the 2010s, then the councils, they have now decades of experience renegotiating leases or
exactly renegotiating, and this is why I say it's harder for them to think through wind and solar because that's how they're thinking about it, right?
It's always been coal, or the power plant. Yeah.
And well, the power plant. This was the first time that lease was being considered since 1969 because it was a 50-year lease. And then now we're like, okay, can we get better terms? Can we improve our terms? So some of the things that we objected to that was in the original 69 lease was labor, exclusion of Navajo labor laws on the reservation where the power plant was. So SRP said they created kind of like this special zone, almost like a special exporting zone. But they say we're in this lease, we're exempt from Navajo law. And so Navajo Nation wanted to assert claims, labor rights, right? They're just saying, when we have a labor dispute at the power plant, that goes to Navajo courts. That doesn't go to outside courts or Coconino County. And SRP refused that and said, no, that's part of the lease. We're not going to be part of that. If you change that, we're going to walk away. And then the other thing was water rights. And we said, we want SRP to not object to our claims on the upper basin water, that hasn't been allocated to either the city of Page or any other user in that north of Lee's Ferry. And then SRP said, no, if you insist on that, it's going to be a deal killer. So those were the two main things we were trying to adjust was the labor and the water in the lease. We were saying, hey, we've been exploited in the past. We're no longer this gullible council. We can assert a strong claim over these issues. And then SRP said, no, that's not going to happen. And in the end, we agreed to their terms. So that was, to me, the interesting thing, despite the fact that we've had decades of this experience and this idea of sovereignty and self-determination, we still had to conform to the terms of a 1969 lease.
And the grand irony being that after all of this, SRP decides to just the power plant down.
Exactly.
Like in 2018 or
But that's never in
2019.
our
Like,
control anyway.
which again speaks to this entanglement, like by deploying tribal sovereignty to enter into these agreements, the tribe gains a lot of things, but they then become entangled in these capitalist systems that they sometimes don't have power in. And yeah, I mean, and actually we're quickly running out of time. But then the impact on the local communities, as you write about, like huge unemployment. If there were communities that completely depended on, be it the coal mining or the power plant as really the main economic driver. So this is incredibly disruptive now over the last, I guess now, decade plus.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And it was really interesting how that played out in our politics. We had we're polarized Republican, Democrats, whatever, but no, all the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't save coal. So despite, this was during the Trump administration too, right? And, supposedly he's like, I love clean, beautiful coal, but the reason why coal failed is not because anybody loves or disloves it. It's because it's less profitable. So in the end, money wins, regardless of ideology. And and money is geared towards Phoenix. It's geared towards big utilities. Power and money are centered more in Maricopa County, in Arizona. It disadvantages rural people, regardless of political affiliation.
Yeah. Again, it's this colonial relationship. I'm trying to remember, is it Gomez, the book that, about the Four Corners, blanking on the author's name, where he's talking about like these metropolitan cores and then the hinterlands, in the Four Corners region that serve them. It's a colonial relationship,
Yeah, exactly.
So we're almost out of time. Do you have any like broad thoughts or lessons that people elsewhere in the West should be thinking about? Like, what are like the Western takeaways that we should have, from this work?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about it in terms of broader implications for the West. So I appreciate the ability to think about that. And I don't think that my takeaways are too different from what I've been advocating for tribes, which is let's rethink our relationship with these industries that we become heavily dependent on, because it creates vulnerabilities, right? It creates these structural vulnerabilities. And then what happens is we have a bust, and then then we're left standing with nothing. Well, industries move on. And then the second thing is, let's not look for magic solutions. And that's where energy transition questions like, okay, now we're saying lithium is going to save us, EV cars are going to save us. And there's a whole extractive economy around that, just changes places, changes form, but it's still we're digging at the earth for finite resources, using a lot of water, disrupting Indian land, replicating colonial relationships, both like in Latin America and here in the US. So there's a lot, there's never a good solution. There's never a perfect solution to the the contradiction of us living on lands, overusing our water and energy supply. We're living unsustainably, in short. That's a contradiction of modernity, especially in the West. So we really got to focus on that. And we might come with bad solutions, but to not have blinders on that, to say, hey, this is great, not to get into that win-win-win mentality, and to actually be aware of some of the costs. Even if we eventually decide to go forward with that, we need to be aware of what are the potential downsides to the things we decide to do. So those are my two broad, hopefully not too overwhelming things that come out of research. So
yeah, we got to take these blinders off. Do you want to give us any insight into what you're working on now, what we might expect from you next?
Yeah, so I'm trying to develop an article, more of a theoretical article based on the book, that's just working on the concept of carbon sovereignty and thinking it through energy transition questions. And then I'm also working on water rights, and I don't know what form that's going to take. I'm collaborating with other scholars like Erica Basumek, who's wrote that book about the history of Glen Canyon Dam, my colleague Teresa Montoya, who's a Dene anthropologist, Tracy Boyles, who wrote this book called The Settler Sea.
Yeah,
so we're thinking more historically, and we're thinking about how do we rethink the Colorado River in a relationship to water in the Colorado River Basin states. So that's a project. We don't know if it's going to be book, special issue, something in between. So that's what we're working on.
I think it sounds great. Thank you so much for your time. Congrats on the book, and I really look forward to seeing what you and some of your collaborators come up with next. So this has been great.
Thanks, Brendan. I look forward to hearing how this turned out, and we'll be in touch.
All right, take care, Andrew.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or on Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates and leave comments. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We're an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understandings about the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah Dahl Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, and just about everything else, so you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm author and editor of a number of books on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. Recently, my book, Native But Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018, won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. In an anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, entitled Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, published by the University of Utah Press in 2019, won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital history, public history project named Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's RENSINK.org, or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind. Cheers.